Before I answer this question, please let me encourage you to do three things. Subscribe to our channel, like us on social media, and consider joining us as a supporter at patreon.com. Calvinism is a teaching that is ascribed to John Calvin, the great reformer in Geneva, Switzerland, who spent time growing up in France and then went over to Geneva, Switzerland, who wrote the great Institutes for Christian Theology. The 5 points of Calvinism were not formulated by John Calvin, but rather they were extracted from his teachings, and they were put together at the Synod of Dort. And the tulip is the acrostic that people use to talk about Calvinism. It stands for total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints. Many great thinkers have been Calvinists. Charles Spurgeon, George Whitefield, R.C. Sproul, John MacArthur, John Piper, Jonathan Edwards' teaching certainly would lean that way. But what should we make of Calvinism? I'd say this: whether one is a Calvinist or an Arminian, we should be gracious to each other on both sides. I love the heartbeat of George Whitefield, a Calvinist, of what he said about the Wesleyan or Arminian John Wesley when he was asked, "Do you think he'll be in heaven?" And Whitefield responded by saying, "I think he'll be so close to the throne of God that I'll be lucky if I even get a glance at him." What a great statement and attitude that a Calvinist or an Arminian should have for each other. This is not an issue that should become divisive. Jesus died on one hill, but we're often splintering the church to death in the name of our pet particularities. We should move away from that. I used to be a 5-point Calvinist, and then I was a 4-point Calvinist. Now I'm a Confucianist. And you'd say, well, what led you that way? David Baggett, a great Christian philosopher, a moral philosopher in particular, wrote a book called Good God. And in it, he talked about this whole idea of if A, then B. If A implies I ought to believe, then B implies I can believe. But if I ought to believe and can't believe, how can I be morally culpable? As a Calvinist, and what I know about Calvinists, I know that they want to say that God is sovereign, and that is true. I began to think that maybe we've overdefined sovereignty, because the definition of sovereignty, under the way I understood it, looked a little bit more like fatalism, that God does what God does. And I think that in our attempt to talk about the sovereignty of God, we don't want to over-define it to look like Allahism or fatalism. And while I totally love my brothers who are Calvinists, I also have stepped back from it and would wholeheartedly agree that we have to call upon the name of the Lord, that there is such a thing as free will. But I don't think being dead in our trespasses and sins means that we're so dead that we can't respond in faith. And I don't think when we say we're responding in faith as a non-Calvinist that we're saying, oh, it means we've done some work. Nobody would say that, but those are statements that are used sometimes to make someone feel like they're contributing. But nobody that I would know of that holds to more of a biblical view of non-Calvinist thinking would say such a thing. So Calvinism, it's part of our rich Christian tradition. They're filled with many faithful brothers and sisters, and I would hope that we could model a spirit of grace, because we're all trying to do the best we can, we hope, right, to figure out what the scriptures say. And ultimately, we want to be Christians, not Calvinists, not Arminians, but Christians who follow the scriptures.